And Baranov tried to negotiate with the Indians. Unfortunately, he could not even find an interpreter. So that never happened. He then turned to Captain Lizyansky of the Neva and ordered him to start bombarding the fort with the cannons on board of the Neva. Now, as we're going around the corner here, notice this beach area. It is very shallow and goes out a long way. And about 50 yards inside that tree line is where the Indian fort was. And so keep that in your mind for a moment, because we're going to talk about what happened in regards to those. Okay, before we get off the bus, let me just take a moment and finish our narration. If I don't do it this way, I'll never get it done. And this way you can sit, you don't have to stand around like you often do. Okay, so the Russian ships were anchored right off there. Baranov ordered Lizyansky to start firing at the fort. Because of that long, shallow beach, the Russian ships could not get very close, so the cannon fire was ineffective. Then Baranov ordered his men to go to get into the boats and go ashore. Again, that stupid beach. They couldn't go very far and they were aground, so they had to get out of the boats. They now had to scramble up the that beach. And I love that old British expression, higgledy-piggledy. Those rocks going everywhere, seaweed on it, which is slippery. So the Russians were kind of trying to make their way to the fort, and the Indians were patiently waiting. When the Russians got within musket range, the Indians started firing. A battle ensued. Many Russians were, most of the Russians actually were wounded, several were killed, and of course the Indians also had casualties. And finally, Baranov said, let's go back to the ships. This wasn't working. So Russians retreated back to the ships. The next morning, I think it was, no, I wasn't there. It was about the next morning or morning after, the Russians observed a canoe leaving the fort, skirting right around the Russian fleet, and then disappearing among the islands. Later on that afternoon, it was coming back toward evening, and they watched it, and it definitely had something loaded in it. And so the Russians decided, whatever it might be, they did not want the Indians in the fort to have it. So they opened fire. They shot at the boat, the people in the boat fired back, and then suddenly there was a huge explosion. The Indians had stored powder and ammunition among the islands. And they had sent some of their young men to fetch it, and unfortunately, they hadn't obeyed their orders. Don't come back before dark. So now they had lost the ammunition, and so now the Indians were having problems, so they decided it was best to retreat. So a night or so later, under the cover of darkness, they snuck out the back door and went to other parts of the island where they already had camps of various types established. The Russians found out the Indians were gone, they came ashore, they tore down the Indian fort, went to the Indian village, tore down the Indian village, and in its place built the new Russian settlement, which they called Novoarkhangelsk. And Novoarkhangelsk, meaning New Archangel, actually ended up becoming the capital of Russian colony. Remember earlier I said Baranov really liked it here. Well, he went to Kodiak, he packed up his office, and he moved down here. So this was his headquarters. Well, that also meant this was really the capital of the Russian colony. It was not until 1818 that Buranov finally was relieved of his position. He was supposed to be here for 5 years. He left 1818, 28 years. And it's a long story why all this happened, and I'm not... Go find the book. That's the way I find out. Anyway, so yeah, we don't have time to go into the details, but finally Buranov was able to go home. They had a temporary manager appointed, and then starting in 1820, every 5 years, a new naval officer was assigned to be the chief manager of the Russian-American company. That continued into the 1860s, at which time the Americans and the Russians started negotiating for the sale of the territory. And finally, October 1867, what had once been Russian America now became the Alaska District. What had once been Novoarchangelsk now became Sitka. As I explained to some of you earlier, Sitka comes from a local Indian expression, She Atika. She is the Indian name for the island here. Atika means the outside or ocean side, and so it describes the location. And the Indians actually, they pronounce it Sheetka. We made Sitka out of it. Sitka was the capital of the Alaska District for the rest of the century. Then it was discovered that most of the ships that were going up and down the Inside Passage didn't come around to Sitka anymore. And so for better communication, the government offices were packed up and moved to Juneau, which was a gold rush town. And so Juneau then became our territorial capital, and in 1959 Juneau became our state capital because we became the 49th state of the Union. So that's a real rough overview. Just want to address briefly a couple of things. I often get asked, why did the Russians sell? Well, there were good reasons. I've also heard some off-the-wall stuff, like the Tsar had a huge gambling debt to pay off. So anyway, there are 4 really important factors that entered. If you remember your history, Russians had just lost the Crimean War against the British. State coffers were empty, the army in disarray. They had no way of defending this colony if they had to. The colony was no longer as lucrative as it once was. When the Russians first came here, there were lots and lots of sea otters and lots of other fur bearers. Well, everybody was hunting the sea otter. The Russians, the Americans, the Indians, the British, the French, the Spanish. Everybody was coming here hunting sea otter. So the population had gone way down. Third factor, the economy. The Russians had never learned to live off the land, just like we today. Everything has to be imported. And that, of course, was a large logistics strain. And then finally, the distance. In order to go from St. Petersburg, the capital of Russia, to New Archangel, the colonial capital, took 2 years. Took 1 year. 1 year. You had to leave St. Petersburg and go across Siberia. You cannot travel across Siberia during the summer. It's all marsh. So you had to wait till winter when everything was frozen, then was no trouble. You could get to the coast. Now you got to the Pacific coast, but now you had to wait for summer because of the winter storms in the North Pacific. They are severe. And as we talked earlier, even when the weather was supposed to be good, the Neva got low on the rocks and sank. So, by the time that you finally got here, a year had gone by. There was another way of doing it. You go to a European coastal town, take a ship into the Atlantic. Now you had to make a very weighty decision. Cape of Good Hope or Cape Horn. Wow. Neither one are good. They're always fraught with danger. But then you made it finally into the South Pacific. Now you had to go all the way up into the north. By the time you finally got here, a year had gone by. Can you imagine Alexander Buranov, when he first got here? He had a very difficult situation he needed guidance on, because there was another company that was really causing serious problems with Buranov's company and the native people. He sent a letter to Russia. It took 1 year. Meanwhile, he had to make a decision. So, yeah, it was very interesting in those days. You know, we think the American postal service is slow. Okay, we're going to get off the bus for a while. And our departure time here is 11:30.
Okay.
To get to the dance show. Let's see. There's a building visitor center down there.